and welcome to our very, very special webinar this morning. Just when I'm saying welcome, I'm just waiting because there are a few people just coming in through the door at the last minute, and then we'll be, say, ready to go. For those of you who know me, I'm Michael Morgan, CEO of Herrmann Asia. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce you to our very special guest, Gaiti, a new and budding author, amongst other things. So just before I introduce Gaiti, let me just go through, obviously, the normal housekeeping. We'll be running for around about 50 minutes, give or take. We'll see how we go. If you do have to cut away or whatever, we are recording it, so you'll be able to listen to it later on. We'll be doing some activities later on as well, and we'll be using the poll feature, which I think you're all familiar with. We'll be doing the chat box. And also, there's a Q&A feature, which I think you know. So as we go through this, if you do have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. We'll either deal with them as you type them in, if they're appropriate to what we're talking about at that time, or say we'll deal with them at the end, or Gaiti might well contact you directly if it's a very specific question, but we'll try deal with everything. Behind the scenes is Chris, our technical man today. So if anything goes wrong, we can call on him. So first of all, let me introduce you to Gaiti. So hi, Gaiti.
Hello, good morning.
Yep. And you're going to be hearing a lot from Gaiti as we go through this. What I want to do is we'll make it a nice, easy conversation, and say one that hopefully you can join in. So that's good. And I say, Tumis, welcome from Vietnam. So we are going to inquire in a little while who we've got, and I guess the different cultures. So get ready to answer that. Let me tell you a little bit about Gaiti. She's a HBDI practitioner, and she's one of our associate trainers, so we work very closely with her. But as Gaiti will tell you, she runs obviously her own business as well. Pertinent today, she's a certified cultural intelligence professional, and she'll tell you what that means. But most importantly, she's author of this new, can I say, best-selling book, Curious About Culture. It's certainly becoming a well-known book in that it was actually featured in the Weekend Australian as one of the business books that you need. And I got my dog-eared copy here, so it's well worth a read. Gaiti, she's of British Asian heritage. She's lived and worked in, I think, at least 3 continents, traveled extensively around the world in her 30-plus year career, working across, I guess, as a lot of us have, very diverse cultures. In a nutshell, I think Gaiti is cultural diversity. So welcome, Gaiti.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for having me here today. And just a correction on the bestseller, the book hasn't actually launched yet, but hopefully in the future it will be. Okay,
well, it will be a bestseller, and I'm sure somebody will be after the film rights. In my reading of the book, one thing I guess I want to do is you define culture as a set of shared beliefs, traditions, values, and identity of a group. And so it means that we belong to a group, or perhaps many, many different groups. So that's what we're talking about in terms of culture. What I'd like to start off by doing, Gaiti, is asking you, why were you curious about culture? So what led you to put the effort in and write the book?
What led me to write the book? Really good question. And if I was to be honest, I'd say I didn't really set out to write a book. But 2020 happened, and many unexpected things came along with it. It did open up a lot of space for me to think through some ideas. But essentially, about a couple of years ago, I went to the States to certify as a cultural intelligence specialist, as you mentioned, and I came back to Australia with certified to train with their frameworks, using their assessments and their programs. And whilst it's a fantastic framework, I felt like it had left some questions unanswered for me, in that a lot of the framework hangs on national culture, and you've quite rightly mentioned that we have multiple cultural identities. And so I wanted to delve into that a little bit from a personal experience of culture, and also looking to beyond national, but whether it's gender, generation, how education shapes us, or how language shapes us. So it was really an exploration and a period of introspection that led me to write the book.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so another good example, I guess, of lockdown.
Exactly.
During lockdown. Tell me though, to me the most interesting thing is, and I think I believe you call it your cultural narrative. Can you tell us a little bit about Gaiti, where she came from, what she did? Who is she, culturally wise?
Yeah, look, I'll preface this by saying, Michael, that writing a book is a very introspective and very introverted experience. And if there's anyone else on this webinar who has written a book, they might appreciate that writing it is one thing and talking about it is a completely different thing. So as I'm finding with all this publicity right now, it's really challenging to talk about. But I'll try my best. So my cultural narrative, as you mentioned, British Asian heritage. So I was born to migrant parents from Pakistan in the UK. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales in the north of England. So very picturesque, very beautiful. But as the only, what I would say, Asian family for miles around, the cultural differences, I became very aware of them very early on in life. And whilst we were going to school, and obviously English was our main language, we'd come home and our parents would only speak Urdu to us, or they would speak the dialect of Punjabi between themselves, because they reckon that if we're going to school, we're going to pick up English anyway. We live in England. But they held on to their cultural values and the religious values quite tightly, knowing that we were going to be exposed to so many other things. So how do we hold on to this, and how do we make sure we sort of instill these values in our children? So the differences between myself and my friends became very apparent in very early days. So it wasn't really a conscious awareness I had around it. I just knew that I was different and very different. But essentially, I lived in the UK, school there till about the age of 18, 19. And then I went to Pakistan for 4 years with my mother at the time. And I married at a very young age, actually my first cousin, which you'd be surprised to hear, as it's pretty illegal in some countries. But I married my first cousin. I lived there for 4 years. And then I sort of decided after I had my daughter that life wasn't for me, and it wasn't an environment where I wanted to raise my child. So I got up and left. Let's say I did a runaway act. So I got away and I left, and I ended up in Dubai. And Dubai, as you know, is a cultural melting pot. I lived there for 18 years, started off a career in retail, went through petroleum, ended up working with the Dubai government. So that was a fascinating journey. When I arrived in Dubai, it was a village. When I left, it was a cosmopolitan city. Met every possible culture I could there, and traveled extensively on behalf of the Dubai government. And then about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to relocate here to work with a family business in Australia, Pass Bailey. Some of you may be familiar, luxury retail, probably Australia's only luxury brand. Incredible experience, Greek family origin, strong Japanese influence with the pearling business, and worked with them for 4 years or so, and then took a 1-year sabbatical to travel the world and explore a few things and take that time for a bit of introspection. I traveled South America a lot, fell in love with tango, for those who know me, and I know some people on this webinar do. One of my biggest passions and hobbies is tango dancing, and I've been very fortunate to travel to different parts of the world to partake in that hobby. And yeah, and then set up my own business, and the rest you've sort of mentioned through Rabbani Collective and the HBDI Association. And here I am as a cultural intelligence specialist with a book to my name.
Yeah. Wow, so that's pardon me, that's quite a journey. One of the things I guess I got out of the book, and it's about being curious, is, I guess, listening, watching, observing, and picking up the clues. What I'd love everybody to do, just quickly in the chat box, is, having just listened to Gaiti's journey, Gaiti's cultural narrative, see how many, I guess, different cultural contexts or experiences you heard her talk about. From being born in the Yorkshire Dales, which is a long way, from Dubai, what was some of the different cultural contexts, cultural experiences you heard Gaiti talk about? So it's good because it just gets our mind thinking about these various cultural groups that we bump into. So yes, as somebody said, Sarah says, Yorkshire, it's a culture itself. It certainly is. I still remember that lovely British TV show about the vet. I can't think what it was called, but yeah. Yes, at least 6 cultural experiences there. We've got obviously Dubai, and I know that there are quite a few of us on the call today who've experienced Dubai, and it certainly is.
All creatures great and small.
All creatures great and small.
That was it. Yeah.
Yes, and here's a comment. Yeah, that culture is about language. It's about faith. It's about way of living. So, any comments, Gaiti, on the comments that you're seeing about?
Yeah, I have to say, gosh, we've got some really good listeners here. Things that I have said and things that I haven't said that have been picked up on really well. So absolutely right. I think it speaks to what I mentioned earlier. It's not just about national culture. So the easier ones are to say, look, I lived in all these different parts of the world, and parents hail from Pakistan, but there's the faith that comes with that. There's the the religious context. Yeah. There was tango, love it. There's also language that plays a big role in how we see the world, how we communicate, how we express ourselves. And also, when we talk about the Yorkshire Dales, we talk about a village, and then we talk about the cosmopolitan hub and city of Dubai, and then we talk about being here in Sydney. So you talk to culture and the definition of culture. I would simplify culture to say it's the way we do things around here, right? So that can be organizational culture. It can be, Michael, how you do things at Herrmann versus how I do things here in my business, or how my clients operate. It can be how we live and work and show up in a village environment or a city environment. So you can apply it to so many different, it can be, if you're part of a golf club, there is a culture within a golf club. Yeah. So it's a group phenomenon. It's something that we share. But what my book speaks to very much is about our personal culture. So when you look at me, you might assume something. When you hear my voice, you might assume something else. But what's my lens on culture, and what's my personal culture and my cultural narrative, that shapes the way I view you, or the way I interact with you.
Okay. Yeah. Now, in that, you said, culture is the way we do things around here. I believe, and in the book, you mentioned some pretty amazing figures about the cultural diversity in Australia. So I'm wondering if you can share that, because that makes it difficult, I guess, because we don't do things the same here. We all do it differently. And I know there are a lot of people listening today from other cultures, we might not have numbers on those other cultures, but Australia is a good example of that melting pot.
Yeah, and you're right there. Let me just, because my blue quadrant isn't so strong, Michael, so I've prepared a little slide to share. But essentially, you're right. I mean, my cultural narrative is quite international, but we need to look also within our sort of national borders and recognize. I do a lot of work with migrant groups and asylum seekers, refugees, and helping them integrate into the sort of the Australian culture and the norm of how we do things around here. And I always preface that with explaining that Australia is a migrant nation. And so if we look to our stats, I think we're somewhere at 24 to 25 million as total population. You know, about 7.5 of us are migrants living here in Australia. So whilst there's a norm of the way we do things in Australia, there's a lot of diversity here as well. Some of these figures, like 300 languages spoken in homes here, more than a fifth of Australians speak a language other than English. And as I mentioned, you know, some of the ideas I explored around how language shapes our view and how we express ourselves as well. Yeah. You also mentioned that we have potentially some people here from New Zealand and Singapore. So I just took the liberty to gather some information on those. And I'm sure some people online here have more information than I have, but we have a lot of diversity within these nations too. We know Singapore to be very multicultural, and it's also known to be one of the most religiously diverse nations. A fact that I found about New Zealand, which was interesting to me, was that amongst the 3 official languages in New Zealand Sign Language is one. So, you know, there are many different cultural groups, and there is a lot of diversity even within our national borders. We don't have to necessarily have an international remit to be culturally aware or culturally intelligent.
Yeah, there's some amazing, you know, stats there. What would be interesting is, again, if everybody could use the chat, what I'd like you to do is type in the chat the culture that you most identify with. So what is the culture that you currently most identify with? And let's see what we get. You can see Indian, Australian, Persian, Mexican, New Zealand, English, Kiwi. Isn't it interesting how same
European
culture,
Kiwi, yeah, I like the definition there.
Yeah, different words. Indian, yeah, British, European.
Turkish, yeah. German, Maori, I love it, wow.
Yeah.
So look at the diversity just here within this group.
That's right.
Without even seeing each other, you know. Yeah.
I also like the one British, because I'm British except when it comes to rugby when I'm English.
Right.
So again, there's a real difference.
Yeah.
Another question just in the chat, I'd love to get, who's living in another culture? I mean, I was born and bred in England, but I live in Australia. So who's living, I guess, in a different culture? So I've got a feeling a lot of us are. So, yep, so Savas in, Vietnam, born in England, Hong Kong. Wow. I'm not sure anybody lives where they started.
Wow.
Yeah,
we're all so well traveled. Look at this. This is amazing.
Yeah, that's right. That's marvelous.
And there's a migrant and there's an expatriate culture as well, because I spent a lot of time in Dubai, but you know, Dubai is I think only about 15% of the population are local Emiratis. The rest are expatriates. So there's a whole different expatriate culture that exists within a lot of places.
Well, look, let's pick up on what I'm seeing in the chat. Mm-hmm. And that is, we've got British and England, we've got New Zealand and Kiwi, we've got, one of the big things that you mention, I guess, in your book is that we don't all see a given culture the same way. You know? So we look at Singapore, we look at New Zealand, and we all see things differently. And I think you mentioned this quote by, is it Henry Thoreau, who says, the question is not what you look at, but what you see. So can you tell me a little bit about that? And I believe it's got something to do with the glasses. So
yeah.
Why do we see different things?
I think the kaleidoscope glasses basically point to the idea and bring to life the idea that if you remember playing with kaleidoscopes when we were younger, or if your children have them, and you look through this lens, the view, the graphics, the design that you see is unique to each viewer, and it's ever changing, right? It's never static, it's always moving. And what you see is very different to what I see. And a lot of it is informed by our own sort of early influences in life, our own social influences, our own cultural identifiers. So whilst I just mentioned, for example, that I lived in Dubai for 18 years, it doesn't necessarily make me an expert on, you know, the Emirati or the Arab culture, because I lived a highly expatriate lifestyle. I spoke English with everybody. So my experience of a particular culture, even if I travel well, could be quite a thin slice of that culture, right? Versus someone else who's born and bred there, or perhaps my daughter who was raised there, learned Arabic, went through the school system. So everyone's experience is unique, and cultural identities partly are what people have put here on the chat and said, I'm this and I'm that, and I identify with being from Vietnam, or I identify with being, you know, from a particular national culture. But then what other people see and what other people project upon you can be quite different. Again, coming back to my identity, what would you think? What would you say? Some people may pick up the British accent. Some people may just hear that I live in Australia. So it's really quite unique, which is why I delve into this topic in my book around introspection. It's all about understanding yourself and your own lens on culture before you can truly start to appreciate and understand other people and connect and build those effective cross-cultural relationships.
Yeah. So obviously one of the first things we've got to do when we meet a Kiwi or somebody from Singapore, whatever, is probably stop and ask them a question, because we just cannot assume. I mean, I'm looking again at some of the comments. Andrew being Australia back after Vietnam, Abu Dhabi. I mean, everybody's life experience is so different and so rich. Let me, I guess, obviously, as you know, Herrmann is very much about thinking, and your book, I know, weaves in and out of the importance, I guess, of thinking the way we think. And in particular, you talk about clear thinking. Which is, I think, the book around thinking fast and slow. And I think you've got an experience of that. So can you tell us why fast thinking and or slow thinking is pertinent to understanding culture?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some really good comments in here that I'd really like to, like Neil's got a great comment here about what people project upon him, right, as to whether he's Irish or he's not Irish, or how he's seen. And I think it comes back to my comment around that thin slice and what we perceive and what we assume other people to be. And I think the story you're alluding to here, Michael, is the one that got picked up in the media recently, which is a very personal story to me, but it was about my assumption about a potential partner who happens to be my life partner now for the last 5 years, happy to say. But when I initially started dating him and we went out, I remember we actually met through tango. We went tango dancing one night, and it was really late night and he was really hungry, and he said, I need to find something to eat. Like, we didn't really have time to find somewhere. It was like 12 o'clock at night. What's going to be open? And he found this little Pakistani, like, I don't know, kebab shop or something, and said, can we just sit here and eat? And he took me in there, and I sat there, and then I saw, which I need to explain to people here for a little bit of a background story, is that my partner is of Sri Lankan origin. So he was born, he's very dark skin. He was raised in Hong Kong. He spent a majority of his life in Hong Kong, and then he spent a very big part of his life in China. So he had businesses in China and Hong Kong, and he speaks fluent Mandarin. So I've got here a very globally minded person of Sri Lankan origin, but there was something about looking at him and sitting in this Pakistani cafe late at night in an environment where there were a lot of men. And there was something that just said to me, I don't want to be here, and I don't want to be here with you. And I was ready to run off. And this goes back to Daniel Kahneman's work about thinking fast and thinking slow. This was my sort of emotional thinking around, you know, that fight or flight. I just wanted to run because this person in front of me was a bit of a risk. And I mentioned that I'd spent 4 years in Pakistan, and it wasn't the best time of my life. It was a very challenging culture to integrate into, highly Islamic, a lot of ideas enforced upon me from a gender perspective as well, what I could and couldn't do. And then I'm sitting here in front of this man thinking, feeling and sensing, I'm going to get dragged back into this world that I don't want to be part of. And it was that ability to step back from that, maybe a day later, and say, actually, what is it that's driving this emotion in me? Is it really this person, or is it my experience? And I just basically had to bring in what you mentioned, the clear thinking, and rationalize this. So it's not too different to what we talk about with whole brain thinking as well, is rationalize this sensation that I had and say, what is really in front of me here? And am I judging this person literally based on the color of his skin? And for those who don't know, I mean, you know, Southeast Asian, we can all get clubbed into the same sort of grouping, but Sri Lankans are much more, I say, open-minded than sort of the slice of Pakistani culture that I'd experienced. So my projection onto him was very unfair. And he's the one that actually raised this when I was writing this book and said, do you remember that time that happened and you had this discussion? And he didn't understand where I was coming from because he hadn't experienced the life and the culture I had. So you should really bring that into your book. And I did. So I wrote about this cultural mirror and how these things project back on you and how you really need to slow down and understand. So I think it speaks to, you know, this very fast life that we're in and how we can be really quick to jump to assumptions, mental shortcuts, you know, biases, big topic right now, unconscious bias. This was my unconscious bias about someone who was sitting in front of me that forced me into clear thinking about, is it really about him, or is this something from my past that's playing out for me? It's a very personal story for you there.
So, I mean, that's such a lovely and powerful story, and that ability to take the deep breath and slow down, and just not react. You also, in the book, I guess, talk about, I was going to say a framework, but I think it's 6 filters or 6 different ways, you know, that you can, or that we look at culture, and people have already mentioned it. I think one's language, there's probably gender. I think I'm a baby boomer. Can you tell us about these perspectives, filters, you know, and how they work?
So in part of my book, I talk about the 6 filters that I went on a deep dive exploration of, aside from the work I'd done on sort of national cultures and the framework that I think we're going to share with people towards the end as well, through a little exercise for them to get an idea of cultural values. But the 6 filters that I speak to are, like you mentioned, gender, which is a big topic right now anyway, generation, education, faith, language, and then national comes in at the end. But generation is a good one. You can look to the fact that we've got, about 4 generations in the workplace today, and how we communicate, what our values are, and how we're seen and perceived, and what sort of biases play out. I've also done a lot of work personally in family business, and that 2nd, 3rd generation family business is a really interesting dynamic. And how sort of the values can create a sense of conflict, because there's different ways of approaching work, or work-life balance, or how we manage, lead, or coach. So I speak to some of these factors in the book. And I think I was just reflecting this morning before the webinar, I think one of the biggest takeaways potentially for this audience is the bit I wrote about education. because I think our culture and our educational experiences early in life also inform a little bit about how we like to learn and how we like to teach. And understanding the different cultures that you may be engaging with in your various training programs, in your organizations, and understanding what the learner's journey is and where they come from. It can be quite different depending on which culture you come from. And I broadly talk about it in the book between sort of Eastern education systems and Western education systems, and the role that a teacher and a facilitator plays in those contexts.
Yeah, yeah. I just listening to you talk. I mean, I found the last, what are we, 18 months, life in COVID to be really interesting, because like so many people here today, I did a lot of travel. Yes, I lived in Sydney, but I was in Singapore everywhere. And so I thought I lived a pretty, I guess, culturally diverse life. When COVID came and lockdown came and my world became virtual, right, what I've actually discovered, and I think your definition of culture has really brought it to a fore, that because of the virtual world, and I now travel extensively virtually, I am meeting so many different cultural groups without even being aware of it. Not just nationality or where you live, but as you say, language, gender, Gen X. I mean, you name it. It really is, exciting and challenging.
Absolutely, there's a lot to navigate.
Oh yes, there certainly is. All right. Big question, I think, and let's get people involved a little bit as well. But I think it's about, because in the book there's a big segment about values, and I think we've all experienced how they differ and vary from culture to culture. I mean, I wasn't born in the Yorkshire Dales, but I certainly was born and bred in England, where it's sort of every person for themselves, and it's a very individualistic type culture. When I came obviously to Asia, I realized that it was very different. And I mean, another experience that I can always remember was the first workshop I ever ran in Singapore. I went up there, ran this workshop, and at lunchtime I had to phone up a friend and I remember saying to Ken, I don't know what's wrong with them. Nobody said anything. They were just quiet. And of course, Ken reminded me, or not reminded me, told me, that, there was a different culture at work, different dynamic at work. And, it took me quite a while to, I guess, understand it, come to terms with it. So what can you tell us about culture and values, and these often opposing values?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you mentioned there, Michael, as well, because it speaks to the education I was just talking about in terms of how you're seen as a teacher. So in sort of, if you were running that same program here in Australia, you're seen as a facilitator of thought and of dialogue, and we look to get involved and we want to share. And even now we're really conscious that though we're on a webinar, we want people to talk, we want there to be dialogue, we want to hear from people. But essentially in that environment, your role was very much an authority figure as a trainer and a teacher. And there was a lot more responsibility on you to teach the students who are in that room. And they're not necessarily going to speak up, because if they feel that if they do, they're challenging your authority. So, I mean, that's a good segue into something we agreed we might share today, which I'm happy to do. I mentioned that or you mentioned, I think, in the book that I speak to cultural values, the cultural intelligence program that I'm certified to deliver here is it comprises of many different things, but part of it involves 10 cultural values that we look at. And so what I've done for today to keep this a little bit more interactive and engaging so that people hopefully take something away that they can maybe apply or think through is 2 values that I thought we could just unpack. And you've already spoken a little bit to this one, but there are cultures that that relate very strongly, and I think a picture speaks 1,000 words here, but to the individualism. So it's very much about cultures that believe that the emphasis is on my rights and my freedom and my ability to pursue my ambitions and my dreams, versus the collectivist cultures where the emphasis is on the group and on relationships within that group and creating harmony and bringing everybody on board. And a really good example of this, or to bring it to life, is raising my daughter, who I refer to as well, and I tell quite a few stories, as a third culture kid. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, but I know some of you from the chat have had this experience either yourselves or through your own kids. A third culture kid is one who is raised in a culture that does not belong to either parent. So similar to Neil, my daughter has this experience where people ask her where she's from, and it can send her to tears because, you know, what she looks like is not where she's from. She's got a very complicated story, having been born in Pakistan, raised in Dubai, having a British passport, now an Australian passport, and a very international American accent. Where are you from is a loaded question, because where do you want me to be from? Because whatever I say, you're not going to be appeased with the answer I give. But I've gone off on a tangent, coming back to this value. You know, she was schooling in Dubai. She had a couple of really good friends who hailed from sort of more collectivist cultures. Now, in individualism, we teach our children values. We teach them to you know, pursue their dreams and their ambitions, and we teach them well, we set them on their way, and they go off and hopefully they realize those ambitions. But when it comes to collectivist cultures, where a child studies, what they study, and sometimes even who they marry, is often a family decision. And the decision is based on what's better for everyone, not just what's better for the child. So that's a really good example of how some cultures are taught to blend in, and some cultures we're taught to stand out. So you can already, from the mixed cultures we've got here on the webinar, you can start to identify some of your early childhood influences and what may have informed your personal culture. Maybe you hold certain cultural values true, but you're raising your children in other environments. And I think that's where my parents may have struggled as well, having come from a collectivist culture where they felt the need to tightly hold on to these values in an individualistic culture. So what we do with a framework like this is we do a profiling exercise, and we ask people a set of questions. It's quite similar to the HBDI survey, and it spits out a profile, and essentially there would be a little asterisk or a little star that would mark where people sit. And of course, you know, your personal culture may not relate directly to your national culture, because we are all a mix of cultures. So whilst in this case, we may say, look, Australia sits within that Anglo-cultural cluster. So typically in Australia, we're an individualistic society. And let's say typically the Arab world or Confucian Asian, we have quite a few callers today from that cultural group who may relate to the collectivist culture. And we look at this and we sort of say, how do these differences play out in the work environment, as an example? And one I can speak to, which relates to your story, Michael, is that it was interesting that an American organization, an American being very individualistic, goes into somewhere like India and implements their rewards and recognition programs for, let's say, McDonald's in India, as a program that is employee of the month. So, you know, they acknowledge someone, their performance, they stick a poster on the wall. But what they found was that that was not motivational for their staff, because in the Indian culture generally, and this is general, yeah, so we have to be careful not to stereotype, but just get a general understanding of the norms within a cultural group. They're taught to blend in, not to stand out. So they didn't see that the poster on the wall was motivational for them. So understanding how people like to be rewarded, how people are motivated, what people's intrinsic cultural values are, you know, speaks volumes as well in how we manage. The other value I thought I might share with this group was, again, the pictures say it all, but low power distance versus high power distance. And Michael, actually, I wanted to take this back to something you just mentioned about our experience in lockdown. And I have a good personal story of this, because low power distance is where, similar to Australia, egalitarian society. I mean, Australians quite, you know, one of the most egalitarian societies in the world. So everyone's equal, it's fair play, everyone has a voice, we expect everyone to speak up. But in high power distance cultures, there's a bigger distance between leaders and followers. So you can see there is someone at the top of that hierarchical triangle. And we look to those leaders to make decisions, to guide us, and we look to them with a great deal of respect. And how we view people in those authority positions can be very different. So coming back to lockdown, I remember it was that period of serious lockdown. I think it was exactly a year ago over Easter here in Australia, where we were told the directives from the government were that if you're going to go out in Sydney to exercise, you're going to go out and you're going to walk, and then you're going to go back home, but you're not to sit in the parks, right? And of course, being slight rule breakers, my partner and I would go and we would get our takeout coffee and we'd sit on a bench in the park. And I would sit there and there'd be some policing in the distance, and I'd start freaking out saying, you know, the police are here. And my partner's like, so what, you know? And I said, no, we're not supposed to be doing this. We're breaking the rules, you know? So my view on the police was I had a slight sense of fear. Not slight, actually, I was quite fearful, to be honest. And I just felt like I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. And these guys are in power and authority. And my partner's sitting there going, no, but the police are our friends. They're here to help us and support us. They're not here. You shouldn't be afraid of the police. And we still laugh about this today, because it was just a really good example of how we saw those people in authority and power positions completely differently. You know, so often you'll hear people say, in organizations, just to take this back to the work culture, you know, they might turn around and say they have problems. I get this a lot. Managers coming to me saying, you know, my team don't show initiative. They don't speak up. They're not great decision makers. Well, even though we want to empower people, some people don't want that level of empowerment because they look to their seniors for those decisions to be made. So they're very good at executing on those ideas, but they're not necessarily great at taking that initiative. Let's look to where that comes from. It's not necessarily someone's personality. It could be their cultural leaning. So understanding where people's cultural preferences lie is really an important part of building that cross-cultural connection. And we have a framework of 10 values. I speak to 6 of them in the book, and I bring them to life through various stories, experiences I've had with organizations, with people, some of my own stories, just to learn how we can bridge those gaps, because we need to remember that our preference and orientation on this scale, which is what this is, it's a scale, is not right or wrong, which is where I think it speaks really nicely to the HBDI practitioners we have online. You know, it's free of judgment. There's no right or wrong. It's just is, our cultural values just are. But how are we going to bridge them when we're working with groups of people?
Yeah.
So that sort of brings me to the end of that little snapshot that I wanted to share with you, or to share with the group today, just to bring some of the framework and some of these ideas to life. I hope that was useful for you.
Oh, I mean, it certainly was for me. I mean, this whole thing has been amazing, and I'm still thinking about what you said about the third culture kid. That's just lovely. We have a poll, don't we?
We do. I apologize. I should go back to sharing that. I was eager to get out of it. We do have a poll, and I know Chris is there eagerly awaiting. What have I done here? eagerly awaiting our signal. So what we thought we might do here is, with the audience, is go back to this one, individualism versus collectivism. And Chris, if it's okay for you to set up the poll, we might just ask participants to tell us where they think they sit. What's their preference? Do you have more of an individualistic preference? Do you feel you hail from a collectivist culture, or are you moderate? Because that's okay too. You might be somewhere in the middle. This is a spectrum. So if people would like to just put up their personal value preferences there, it would be great for us to, we'll just give everybody, I guess, what, a minute or two to do that. We can just start to see some of the cultural differences within this group.
So what happens now?
So I guess Chris will close the poll and it should show us the results. Right, so we've got, am I right, 17% individualism, 20% collectivism, and 63% sort of moderate, somewhere in between. So it will be interesting to know how that plays out if, you know, we were doing this amongst a project team, and what does that look like? So there's many applications to this, very similar to the HBDI framework. So if we can go perhaps to the next one, Chris, if that would be okay, the low power distance versus high power distance, we could ask everyone to just quickly mark up their preference there. There we go.
Yeah, to me, this is a very interesting one, your story about the police. I really hadn't thought about it.
The police are our friends. I'm like, no, they're here to tell us not to sit on the bench. We're meant to keep walking. Yeah. What I should also mention...
I was born in England where, you know, the bobbies had.
Bobbies, yeah. They were friendly. They were friendly. What I might mention here, Michael, as well, is that your preference might change depending on the cultural group you're interacting with. Right? So it's relative. So that's why answering this may not be quite as easy and it may not be quite as instinctive, but when we do something like this in the context of a cultural group, be it a business environment, then it's all relative. It's all in comparison to our peers where we sit. Yeah. So if we can just, I think, give that another second and then maybe close that as well, and then we can see the results there. Wow, okay, so low power distance, 42, high power distance, 7%, and moderate, 51. And again, I think some of the moderates might shift depending on what context we were actually doing this in, so that the group would have an influence on that as well.
I think, to me, that 7% is quite interesting, the high power distance in this group there. So that's a very low figure.
I guess we have to assume maybe not everybody's also contributed here.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Great. I can stop sharing now. Thank you.
I'm still looking at some of the comments in the chat and everything else. All right. Well, we've almost kind of used up our time. Gaiti, that for me exceeded expectations. I mean, you and I have chatted about this on a number of occasions, but yeah, there's some wonderful stuff in your book, and I'm sorry I've sort of destroyed it and it's all doggy and everything else, but
I'm glad you've read it. That's it should be dog-eared if it's been read.
Well, again, I mean, you only have to listen to the news, not only in our part of the world or this part of the world, but the world generally, and the problems, I guess, and challenges around different cultural groups is just mind-blowing. And what's happening in Australia right now. And I think for me, one of the big takeaways that you've given me is the golf club is a culture. So I actually belong to a lot of different cultural groups, and of course I also don't belong to a lot of different cultural groups. So you've certainly increased my awareness dramatically. Okay, if people want to know more, I guess I would recommend, and you've got a special, don't you, a hidden code?
Yes, I do. So if anybody here in this network would like to buy my book, I'm happy to offer a preferential rate. If you go to my website, which is rabbanicollective.com, you go to the webpage for the book and just enter a code, which is I am curious. That would be, thank you, all uppercase, just as Michael's popped in there in the chat box without space. Then please do so, and that will, I think it gets you a 25% discount. That offer's open only till about the 10th of April, because I believe it is launching in stores this week. It is online. I've had several people tell me they've bought it in the UK, in Dubai. So it is out there already. If you want it from a bookshop, then Dimmocks and all the usual bookstores should have it by next week.
Okay, hang on. Somebody.
We could get Linda or is it Kate to just send that code out afterwards as well with the recording, maybe?
Yes. Let me try that. That should go to everybody now. Okay, and so if anybody wants to know anything, or I think contact you, Gaiti, you'll be happy to.
Absolutely. I mean, here's my website, I think rabbanicollective.com, but just look me up by name on LinkedIn, I'm there. Yeah.
Okay, terrific. And what are you going to be curious about next?
What am I going to be curious about next? We might have to leave that till next time. I think this book has taken on a life of its own, which I hadn't expected. I mentioned to you my reason for writing it was 2020. I didn't expect to be here with a published book, so I'm still catching up.
Lovely. Yeah. Okay. And I'll wrap up, I think, by doing two things. I notice in the chat that, Gaiti, a lot of people not only thanking you for the webinar, but thanking you for your openness, honesty, and the personal stories that you've been sharing. It really does bring the whole cultural thing to life. So you say your book has taken a life of its own. Well, I think you've given it life. So nice. Well done. It's been terrific.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate it. Thanks to you and the Herrmann team.
Okay. And thanks everybody for tuning in. What I think, as I say, you'll agree, has been an hour well spent. Okay, so we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Linda. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Gaiti.
Thank you.